Hey guys, welcome to the last section of the series on your Reformation PowerPoints. This is part 5. We're going to wrap up talking about what is known as the Counter-Reformation, also known as the Catholic Reformation, and we're going to go into detail a little bit about that today. So, the Catholic Church responded to the Reformation by enacting very critical changes. It is important to understand that they didn't change everything. It wasn't like all of a sudden, okay, Martin Luther wants us to fix things, so we're going to fix it. In fact, they actually stuck to a lot of their beliefs, kept them, and actually reaffirmed them. But instead, there were some changes that they realized that needed to be made. And the reason for that is because a lot of them were, a lot of the parishioners, a lot of the followers of the Catholic Church were starting to leave. And therefore, they wanted to try to get them back and regain the power that they had before. So it's important to understand, we kind of touched on this briefly in a previous PowerPoint, but in 1527, the Holy Roman Empire's soldiers who were under the rule of Charles V had disobeyed orders and started marching towards Rome. They very easily overran the city's defenses and they started looting the city, and this is essentially what brings the end to the Renaissance in Rome. Ultimately, when they were there, they had taken the Pope prisoner, and the reason for this is because a lot of the soldiers at this particular time were fed up with the way the Catholic Church was teaching and were very heavily influenced by Martin Luther as his teachings. This was almost 15 years after he posted the 95 Theses, or 10 years, excuse me, and so his ideas obviously had started to spread throughout Europe, and therefore they felt that they were justified in doing this. Fortunately, Paul III, he became the next pope, and he rose to lead the Catholic Church and realized that changes needed to be made because things were getting kind of hairy. It was getting a little scary. People were rebelling, now threatening the Pope, taking him prisoner, and so forth. So something needed to be done. So he created a council. And this council is basically like the opportunity for very important religious leaders, in this case Catholic religious leaders, to come together. And several different changes were decided upon. This council is known as the Council of Trent. And I don't want you to think that this was something that just lasted 20 minutes or so, but this actually lasted about 8 years. And it's going to go over not only things that the Catholic Church was going to stay the same and reaffirm, but also some changes that needed to be made. So the first thing that was decided upon at the Council of Trent was that the Church's interpretation of the Bible was final, and any other interpretation were acts of heresy. Heresy is a very important word that you need to know the meaning of. Heresy basically means anything that goes against the Church. And if you were deemed a heretic, you could be burned at the stake, or you could even possibly be excommunicated. And so this is really important for followers of Christianity to understand, and we can see how it's in complete opposite of what Martin Luther was teaching, because Martin Luther taught that each individual had the ability to interpret the Bible for themselves. But the Church is reiterating the idea that no, the Church is the only and final authority. Number 2, Christians also need faith and good deeds in order to achieve salvation. So as we can see here, this is not a change. This is something that they had always said, something that they stood by, and something that they believed was completely wrong, in which the Protestants had argued with them on, specifically Martin Luther. So if you want salvation, you need to not only have faith, but you need to perform good deeds to prove that faith. Number 3. This again was in direct contrast of what Martin Luther had said, that the Bible and church tradition are equally powerful authorities. So not only was the Bible important, they did recognize that, but some of the traditions that the church had come up with, for example, selling of indulgences, that was just as important because they believe that the Pope is the vicar of Christ. In other words, God's representative on earth. And therefore, since he is a representative of God, he has the ability to come up with church tradition or church doctrine. Number 4, they did not stop selling indulgences, believe it or not. Even after all of that debacle with Martin Luther and John Tetzel, they actually said that indulgences are a valid expression of somebody's faith. However, the one thing here, this is something that did change, telling people that they could buy their way into heaven was forbidden. So they just basically said that that was still a way for them to perform good acts and good deeds, but it didn't mean a one-way ticket to heaven. So all of these reforms that took place, or really, we can't really call them forms, but reaffirmations, this is part of the Catholic history known as the Counter-Reformation. And if you guys know what the word counter means, that means opposite, and so, or against. And so this was something that was against Martin Luther's Reformation. Some of the other reforms, though, that they did realize they needed to address, for example, some things that they said, okay, this may be what we believe, and we're reaffirming that. However, we do recognize some changes. One was the better education for priests and religious officials, especially like Erasmus and other writers who criticized the priests for not being able to read and write. Therefore, they actually started to create schools in order to educate religious officials in the Catholic Church. They also wanted to try to remove as much corruption as possible. So corruption when it came to owning land and having a role in politics, or even marrying or having families, they knew that this was unacceptable. And so those religious officials were removed from their religious position. It is important to understand, though, that the Counter-Reformation didn't just change the church, but it also led to a more conservative era in Europe. And conservative meaning people were trying to find better ways to follow the rules, I guess you could say. Some of this was seen in Baroque art, as you saw from the Rick Steves video that we watched in class. It kind of gives us an example of how the Catholic Church used propaganda to try to convince people that they were right and Protestants were wrong. And another way that they started to become more conservative was changing art. The nudity that was used in the Renaissance was actually seen as immoral. So as you can see on some of the figures here in this painting, for example, on the right you see Peter, the man with the white hair and the beard. He's holding the keys to the kingdom. He has a cloth draping over his genitals, and that actually didn't exist when Michelangelo painted the Last Judgment. That was added later on. A very important person in the Catholic Church at this particular time period that you need to know, please make sure you put him somewhere in your notes, is Ignatius of Loyola. He was actually a former knight, a former soldier, and he is important because he founded the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, in the year 1540. Their mission was to be soldiers for Christ, meaning that they were to battle the spread of Protestantism by spreading Catholicism. So they did everything in their power to try to prevent the spread of Protestantism, and this is kind of one of the reasons why we start to see this time period turning significantly more violent and bloody as this conflict between Catholics and Protestants started to rise. As I mentioned, the members of Society of Jesus are known as Jesuits, and they still exist today. You can actually see their symbol on some buildings in major cities. Anything that has to do with, like Loyola College, for example, is a popular college for people to gain their theology degree. And so really the Jesuits, their main purpose was not only to prevent the spread of Protestantism, but to also lead in the education of the religious leaders. So obviously we're kind of coming up to an end here, but as the years passed, it really did become obvious that these two major events that we've just discussed in class, both the Renaissance and the Reformation, they certainly would have incredibly long-lasting effects on the world. I want you to stop for a moment and think about the way the world is today, and would it be different if we didn't ever have these events in the Renaissance and the Reformation? So a lot of the things that we see around us are affected by these incredible time periods in history. So that was a quick one, really not a lot of information on the Counter-Reformation. The main things you need to take away from it are the Council of Trent, Ignatius Loyola, the Jesuits, what stayed the same, what changed. And so to kind of help you highlight that a little bit more and go into greater detail, there's these two wonderful videos. As you can see, the first one is Tom Ritchie, and his is about 15 minutes long. And I need you on a separate sheet of paper to answer these questions based on Tom Ritchie's video. So what was the Council of Trent? What was being affirmed versus what was being reformed? Who were the Jesuits? And at the end, he's going to talk about something known as the revival of spirituality. I want you to explain that as well. The next video is with Paul Sargent, and it's kind of repetitive with Tom Ritchie, but